Hello, my name is Neil Potter and I have been a coach and a consultant to software organizations for over 30 years and I coached Agile teams since the year 2000. This video series is about going beyond the basics of Agile software development. In this video, I will discuss how to avoid surprises in Agile using risk management. Please click below to subscribe for future videos. Agile teams can get into difficulty when potential problems haven't been assessed. Risk management practices can be added to avoid technical, supplier, and personnel problems. Let me explain. Firstly, let's discuss what the definition of risk is and risk management. Risk management is the identification, assessment, and prioritization of potential problems not guaranteed to occur. If you have a problem, it's not a risk. It goes onto a problem list. Risks are things that are not guaranteed to occur yet. In this situation, the patient obviously has problems, that's why he or she is there. So where do we add risk management to Agile? Well, firstly, Agile teams may be doing a fairly good job already on mitigating or assessing technical risk. They may have discovered a technical risky item in their project and decided to work on that in earlier sprints. So that would be a good example. But we can go beyond that in risk management. We could look at all the steps we do for planning and tracking of the project, like release planning, sprint planning, daily stand-ups, and retrospectives, and we could add risk management to one of those steps. So before we do a risk assessment and look at a risk plan, let's discuss where the sources of risk could be in our project. We actually may have defined some of those already, but maybe lost sight of the information. Maybe assumptions and dependencies have already been defined elsewhere, and they could be the source of risks. Maybe there's a lessons learned or unresolved issues. Again, they could be a source of risk. And assumptions, like stakeholders agree with our scope and a particular person has been allocated for so many months to our project. Again, that's an assumption, but again, a potential risk we could assess in our risk list. And if we have dependencies on other teams, a vendor or another team elsewhere, again, that could be an assumption that they're going to come through correctly, but also seen as a risk in our risk plan. There could be weak areas such as unknown technology. Maybe there are tools or technologies we haven't used before in our team, and therefore they are new to us and therefore risky. Things that are critical or extremely important to the effort. These could be small project tasks like a database modification or installation of a piece of software. But if that activity goes bad and has problems, that would be a source of problems and therefore a risk we could assess up front. And then problems that occurred in past projects that may repeat themselves, such as the loss of key staff, missed deadlines, and error-prone hardware software. Again, these are not guaranteed to be problems now, but they could be because they were before and they could be assessed as a risk. So as we brainstorm our risk list, we want to think through these kind of items in our background to come up with a good risk list. Now, the next few slides show some examples. For example, communication between team members and other teams, management, customers, training to the team members on how we do our work, making sure they know correctly our particular approach, capacity of our team, and making sure that both systems, people, teams have adequate capacity to deal with the workload. Planning activities, if there are particular parts of a project where there could be little planning, that could be a risk itself about to unfold. Interfaces to other teams, both handoffs of information, technical handoffs, interfaces between systems, configuration management, being able to identify the correct versions of software and hardware and use them correctly, or specs and backlogs, budget risks, and maybe even contractors where they could be poorly qualified or have their own problems and cause impact to you. Incomplete or unclear requirements. You'll never have a perfect requirement, but if they're really poorly defined in the backlog, that could be a source of risk, particularly if you have lots of those in the backlog. Little or no design done. Teams could survive with no design or no written down design, but that could be a risk that they don't think through issues particularly well, or they don't remember issues particularly well. Legacy or spaghetti code. Using legacy code that's maybe buggy or spaghetti, that could cause its own set of problems in modifying it, keeping it up to date. integration issues with hardware, software, other teams, and security. For example, the way the system's built and how secure it is could be a risk factor. So now we have our risk sources figured out. We know where to look at to assess risk. We then want to brainstorm into a one place to be able to prioritize and mitigate. So the first column of our table here is a risk list. Pure brainstorm with the team. They can refer back to the other sources for suggested ideas. The format of a risk would take an if-then format. Again, you could do this the second time around as you then tidy up your risk list, or you may be able to actually put it in that format at the very beginning as you brainstorm. Either way, first round or second round of editing, get it into that format. The format is that if a project's problem occurs in our world, then this is the impact in somebody else's world. For example, the impact could be to the customer or management or a vendor. So we may phrase the risk as, if we believe the team here has a potential problem, then the impact to the outside world would be much bigger. We want to make sure the then part of the risk sentence is both accurate, truthful, and scary to get people's attention. Just putting the potential problem, we may lose resources. You may know what that means to you and the impact, but to your recipient, customer, or manager, they really have no idea why you would care. And so to make it more appealing to them and meaningful to them, we want to make sure there's an if we have this problem, then you have that problem. And that problem should be both accurate, truthful, and adequately scary and concise to get their attention. So we end up with a risk list in the if-then format. So after we have done the brainstorm, we have a risk list like the one under the risk heading in our first column, and now we can prioritize it. I recommend a scale of 1 through 10. 1 would be unlikely to occur, and 10 very likely to occur. A 10 would not be guaranteed. A guarantee would put it onto a problem list. We are looking at potential problems here, risks. So 1 is unlikely, 10 is very likely. On the second column, we have consequence, where a 1 is a low impact or consequence, and a 10 is a very high impact or consequence to the project and the overall goal. So I recommend the 1 through 10 scale because then you get a bigger range to look at all the risks on, and you can focus on the top items. So if you look at the then part of the risk, that would lead to a good impact number. The then is how bad would it be if it were to occur. For example, a deadline being missed. That will help the team establish the right consequence number 1 through 10. So a bigger then impact on the first column would lead to a bigger number on the third column under consequence. So after we have done the risk brainstorm and priority setting, we can then focus on the top half of the risk table, typically the 50s and above. So if you look at the red item, has 64, there's 2 levels of action we can take. One level of action is to reduce the likelihood. These are typically smaller, cheaper, earlier, and proactive actions. For example, on the security issue, we could check with the vendors, the design and proposal, do they know about security? We could train the vendor if we need to, and we could increase testing to kind of check that what they're building for us is secure. The second level of action is about impact or consequence. These are typically reactive, larger, and later actions we could take to make sure if we were to realize the risk, it would have less impact to us. So we could escalate to management, we could send a developer to the vendor to help them on the security issues, or we could even change the vendor. So by keeping these separate, we can focus on cheaper, earlier, proactive actions to make the likelihood go down. And then if that doesn't work, or works less well than we would like, then we can work on the consequence actions, which are typically a backup plan. After we have assessed risk, prioritized and mitigated, we have new actions to go take, which we want to put back into the plan. So on the left-hand part of the diagram here, we have a schedule or a task list before we assess risk. And on the right-hand side of the diagram, we have a task or a schedule after mitigating risk and comprehending the new actions into the schedule. So for example, if we go through the left-hand schedule, we assess task D to be high risk. We marked it in yellow there. We could move that earlier in the schedule, give more time to recovery. We could do maybe a mock-up or a trial experiment. We could do a breakdown in more detail of that area. Maybe task D is very large, and therefore more visibility would inherently reduce risk. We could add more time to it to cause that area to not impact other areas later on if there are problems. And we could even change the decision that led to that risk. Maybe task D was using a particular hardware device, and that hardware device is particularly problematic and could be a lot of risk to our team. We might decide to avoid the whole set of risks like that by going backwards and changing the decision to use a different hardware device. So again, there are many things we could do to lower and mitigate the risk. Then if there are actions we decided to take, we could add them back to the schedule. So you can see here we moved task D to be earlier in the schedule, and then new actions that are worth tracking we can add to the end of the schedule to mitigate those. So the left-hand schedule is the schedule before we assess risk, and the right-hand schedule is one modified after we assess risk. Executing the right-hand one is a lower risk schedule than the left-hand one. In conclusion, risk management is an easy addition to any Agile process. It can quickly help teams assess what can go wrong and avoid major problems. Thanks for watching the video. For more help on these topics or your Agile implementation, please see the links below.